Good afternoon. I would like to warmly welcome you today to our side event on uncovering justice gaps in just transitions, why technological solutions won't save the crisis. Organized by the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung and Life e.V., I'm David Williams. I lead the Climate Justice Program of the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung in the New York office, and I will be your moderator today. In the last couple of days, here at COP26, we've been hearing many promises by world leaders on implementing just transitions, promoting a rapid phasing out of coal to stay within the intended limits of global warming set out in the Paris Agreement. It's not just world leaders, but also CEOs from some of the wealthiest corporations who've been given the stage. We've heard from Jeff Bezos, Bill Gates, and Larry Fink on the importance of transitioning towards net zero. It seems clear that greenhouse gases must be cut quickly, though it is less clear how to do this in an equitable way. Considering the privileged space awarded to these voices from the private sector, we think it's really important to offer some critical reflection on these predominantly technical approaches in which many experts see the danger of exacerbating inequality. That is why we want to take a closer look today at the justice gaps occurring in transition processes. And we also want to discuss why technological solutions will not be the solution. We'll start our event today with a video message from Ndivile Mokoena, who unfortunately cannot be with us today. Ndivile is a project coordinator at Gender CC, Women for Climate Justice in South Africa. The focus of Ndivile's work revolves around gender and climate change, particularly policy interventions and advocacy work. Ndivile works closely with small-scale subsistence farming and women farmers, carrying out training courses on permaculture and agroecology, as well as assessing and monitoring climate change adaptation and mitigation policies from a gender perspective. Ndivile will speak today on the background of just transitions, how it is embedded within the global policy framework, as well as elaborating on priorities in implementation and identifying some potential pitfalls.
Good morning, everyone. My name is Ndivile Mokoena. I'm from Gender CC, Southern Africa, Women for Climate and Gender Justice. Thank you so much to Rosa-Luxemburg and to the UN Research Institute for Social Development and Life EV for hosting this event and inviting me. The concept of just transition now predominantly refers to the need to shift the global economy to more sustainable methods of production and consumption to avoid catastrophic climate change and protect biodiversity, while protecting the livelihoods of those who will be most impacted by the transition and ensuring that impacts of climate change do not dramatically exacerbate existing levels of inequality. As we all know that climate change and environmental challenges are having far-reaching impacts on economies, job, and social development. The 2030 Agenda for Sustainable Development and the Paris Agreement on Climate Change provide a global framework to combat climate change, embark on a low-carbon and climate-resilient future, and set the course for social justice. The Paris Agreement notes the imperatives of a just transition of the workforce and the creation of decent work as essential building blocks of global and national responses to climate change. While it is clear that climate change will increasingly require enterprises and labor markets to react and adjust, the goal of environmental sustainability can only be achieved with the active engagement of the world of work. True just transition will take into account the impacts of changes on the well-being of all members of society, including future generations and the people who are hit the hardest. Beyond the impacts of existing labor markets, the main goal is to achieve eco-social justice. There has to be implementation and support of the immediate phasing out of fossil fuels, including prohibiting new permits and leases for fossil fuel companies, and reject false solutions such as nuclear, bioenergy with carbon capture and storage, and carbon markets, and rather commit to large-scale investments in regenerative, sustainable energy solutions that do not imply a massive increase in mineral extraction. These days, we hear trending terminologies like nature-based solutions and net zero, the definition of which is unclear, and thereby poses a real risk to increase the potential of corporate capture of the climate space negotiations and policy. We reject the false solutions like net zero, as it is opening more oil refineries, use our forests as carbon sinks, promote GMOs, take our land, and cause food insecurity. It allows the global big polluters to refuse to pay their historical debts to the global south, and instead allows them to use spaces like the COP as a marketplace to close deals to continue polluting. Climate actions must promote gender-responsive energy democracy and move us away from top-down market-based approaches for energy production, distribution, and control over natural resources. Move towards an economy of care where communities, including women, should have control over their own energy system as well as over other natural resources. World leaders need to consider the reallocation of international security spending towards investment in local energy and resource democracy. Africa's reliance on unaffordable and unreliable electricity is detrimental to the poor people's livelihoods, their health and well-being, especially women and children. Just transitions needs proper integration from local, national to regional and international levels. A just transition to a low-carbon development coupled with political will is possible. Thank you all for listening, wishing you a fruitful event.
Thank you very much, Ndivile. We hope you're able to watch from South Africa. Like Ndivile, there are many others who have been experiencing difficulties in attending COP26 in person this year, particularly from the Global South. There have also been numerous civil society organizations reporting on the issue of participation in the negotiation proceedings themselves, which has left many attendees with the feeling of frustration and disappointment. Therefore, we really appreciate this opportunity of being able to provide a platform for important voices on the issue of an equitable, just transition. And I would really like to thank our panelists for agreeing to take part in what promises to be a really interesting debate. So let me introduce our panelists. To my right, I'll begin with Sasha Gabizon, who is the Executive Director of Women Engage for a Common Future, an eco-feminist organization working on issues which include climate justice, gender equality, and women's rights. Sasha has worked for many years on the global transformation to socially just and gender equitable societies, whilst also supporting the creation of employment and healthy environments. Thank you very much. To Sasha's right sits Rishab Kumar Dir. Rishab is a research officer at the International Labour Organization. He has been working on issues around inclusion, sustainable development, platform economy, and just transition. His past research has dealt with challenges faced in particular by indigenous peoples, which have been exacerbated by climate change. Thank you very much. On the far left sits Dunja Krause. Dunja is a research officer at the United Nations Research Institute for Social Development, leading their work on just transition and transformative adaptation. Dunja is a highly experienced researcher, having worked on a wide range of climate-related issues, specifically environmental justice, climate change adaptation, and the just transition. And to my left sits Taili Terena. Taili is an indigenous and women's rights activist from Brazil, a long-standing fighter in the global climate movement. Taili is on the National Council of Indigenous Women, a representative of the Continental Network of Indigenous Women of Americas, and is amongst those representing the women and gender constituency at COP26 here in Glasgow. So we thought we'd start off by giving each panelist 5 minutes to present some of their work and insights into the just transition and the challenges that come with this concept. After that, I'm going to pose some questions before opening up to the floor or to you sitting at home for about 10 minutes, so you can start preparing your questions while we debate. And then to finish off, I'll be asking each panelist for a final statement. Time is of the essence, so without any further ado, let's get started. Sasha, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Good afternoon, good evening, good morning to everybody. My name is Sasha Gamizon. I'm with Women Engaged for a Common Future. And we have been working with the women and gender constituency here in this process since 2006, when our constituency was created. And so we have hundreds of feminists joining us here. And this is an essential COP, and we need to discuss the issue of just transition for a 1.5 degree world. We need to get out of this COP with very clear commitments to that, and these commitments need to ensure that this transition is gender just, human rights based, and that we minimize the risks of technologies, that we put people over markets, that we protect ecological food systems and our ecosystems. And why do we focus on this as the women and gender constituency? Because women are on the front lines of the climate crisis. Taili will tell us about that later on. But also because women are largely excluded from climate decision making. You have seen the heads of states at the beginning of this conference with only very few female decision makers. And you have maybe seen the report of the Secretariat, which shows that in certain negotiations on finance or on technology, you have very few women taking part. That's why we are specifically interested in a just transition, and we specifically want to look at the technological aspects of that. And we know that the decisions here at the COP need to do everything to make sure that we remain below 1.5 degrees global warming. We have maybe 7 years and 8 months left. And if we want to succeed, we need sustained cuts of carbon emissions, and we need them now. And we should not lock funds and not invest in false climate solutions. Unfortunately, at this COP, when we look at the negotiations around Article 6, if we look at all the pavilions in the rooms and the many side events, we see that there is an enormous push for what we call false climate solutions, net zero strategies, which will put us on the wrong path. And therefore, we are calling to really make sure that we put the protection of our ecosystems, the support to indigenous peoples and local communities forefront, and of course, women's rights and human rights. So the Women and Gender constituency opposes the net zero false climate solution, and that includes solutions which are presented as nature-based solutions. We already heard from the colleague from South Africa that she talked about this as well, and I'll try to see if I can move to I think I've already done that part. So we're really questioning how to make sure that we have a just transition and that we don't invest in business as usual and not in dangerous techno fixes. What we see with the net zero approach is that it's very much based on carbon offsets, postponing real reductions in emissions, and it's also very much based on carbon colonialism. As many of these pledges are supposed to take place in the Global South. And we see a huge competition with food sovereignty, land grabbing, and therefore linked to human rights abuses. So what we are looking at in today's negotiations is to identify these false solutions. We have listed many of them in the background briefing called False Solutions by the Women and Gender Constituency. There's also a very good publication by which is called Resist False Solutions to Climate Change, which I recommend you check out. And I'll just mention a few of these technologies which are being proposed, but really which are not at the moment a basis for a just transition. They increase injustices. This includes bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, and is very much linked indeed to this framework of nature-based solutions, where we see that one of the main problems is really around the issue of focusing on large tree plantations where we have direct competition with food security. If all the calculations and all the pledges which are being made on nature-based solutions would have to come true, we might need 80% of the land which is currently already being used for food production. So we have a direct clash with food sovereignty. And many of these programs are implemented by large corporations and are at the detriment of local communities, indigenous peoples, and also women. Research from the RED Plus programs, which tried to invest in reforestation, have shown that women are being excluded from their land tenure as a result of these programs. They have less right to land ownership and therefore have not been able to be qualified for the ecosystem service payment systems. So there are many examples like that, and I think we have to move on. Is that what you're saying?
Unfortunately, but fear not, for I'm sure we will be talking about the false climate solutions that you mentioned just now. And elaborate on those concepts. But for now, I would like to pass on to allow Rishab the opportunity to present his work.
Thank you, and thank you to the organizers, because there's very little time. I'll quickly get into the issue. I'm going to twist your question a little bit. Rather than saying what the challenges with the concept of just transition, I would sort of turn it around and say, why do we need a just transition, and what specifically are we talking about when we look at the threats that are coming already? So I'm from the International Labour Organization. Now this organization is home to the ILO Convention number 169 on the rights of indigenous and tribal peoples. And I'll begin with the issue that indigenous and tribal peoples face when it comes to, for instance, climate change here. And in our research, we found that there are a distinct combination of issues that this group specifically faces, which no other group faces. And we identified 6 characteristics. One is poverty and inequality. The other is dependence on lands and natural resources, geographic remoteness and vulnerability, migration and increasing dependence on the informal economy because of the impacts of climate change, gender inequalities, where on the one hand, indigenous women play a vital role in traditional and non-traditional livelihoods and unpaid care work, yet at the same time there are issues around discrimination within and outside of communities. And then there is the issue of lack of recognition of rights, institutional support, and inclusion in public policies. And when we look at these distinct combination of threats, we see that indigenous peoples are particularly vulnerable to the impacts of climate change. So what does this mean when we talk about climate action? So this means that climate action itself, when excludes indigenous peoples, can exacerbate the kind of vulnerabilities that exist. And at the same time, indigenous peoples are not just victims or subjects of development, they're key agents of change. This is an important statistic that I love to cite. It's basically that indigenous people care for an estimated 22% of the Earth's surface and protect nearly 80% of the remaining biodiversity. So they have a key role to play. And in this regard, consultation and participation of indigenous peoples in designing climate policies and taking forward climate action is very important. And I started with the issue of indigenous and tribal peoples because at the ILO we have been looking at what would be just transition from also an intersectional lens. And I'll move to the kind of issues persons with disabilities face. Now, they have been rather invisible in the climate discussions. Yet in the world of work, already we see that that persons with disabilities have historically faced serious challenges, hampering their ability to contribute equally, which is not only a violation of their rights, but also loss for our societies and economies. Now, many persons with disabilities continue to face discrimination with respect to opportunities and treatment and outcomes in the world of work. So for instance, they have disproportionately low representation in the global labor market. Even when they're employed, they face obstacles such as poor promotional prospects and poor working conditions. Now, when we see the impacts of climate change coming into play, we see that there could be reduced job opportunities, wherein, say, persons with disabilities might struggle to find work, especially if employers harbor misconceptions about their work capabilities. There could be mobility limitations and health conditions, specifically with regard to heat stress, so that could exacerbate challenges. So we see a scenario where climate change exacerbates the threats that persons with disabilities already face in the labor market. Again, what does just transition mean in this case? That means including persons with disabilities when projects and programs are designed, when a transition to a green economy is happening, so that we address the structural inequalities that persist. Similarly, we see that there are challenges with gender inequalities which exist in the current labor markets. And these, we see gender gaps, whether it is sectoral or occupational segregation, dependence on the informal economy, poor working conditions, limited access to social protection, and of course, the disproportionate amount of unpaid household and care work that is shouldered by women. Now, these challenges are also to be addressed when we are engaging with the just transition, because climate change, again, can exacerbate many of these challenges. So when we look at just transition, a key principle becomes equality of opportunity and treatment of women and men is established as a specific focus and goal from the outset, so that there is inclusion of persons with disabilities, inclusion of indigenous and tribal peoples, inclusion of women, and groups which are already facing a situation of marginalization at times, while recognizing that these groups play an important role in taking forward climate action. They are important actors in labor markets. They have important contributions to make when we are talking about ambition, when we're talking about the shift to a low-carbon economy. On that note, I'll leave it and we can take up the
Thank you very much, Rashad, particularly for highlighting issues which I think we don't sort of hear enough about. We've been hearing a lot about sort of just transitions in the plenary meetings, but you've really highlighted aspects there which I think commonly aren't mentioned, particularly during the World Leaders Summit. So thank you very much. I will pass the floor now to Dunja.
Thank you very much, David. I wanted to start by showing you this report, which is actually the first thing we did when we started working on just transitions, and it's called Mapping Just Transitions, which we did 3 years ago in 2018 because we started seeing just transition initiatives, policies and plans popping up really left and right, and not only in more places around the world, but also involving a lot more types of stakeholders. So while it has started as like a really labor movement, trade unionist approach rooted in kind of very local struggles for justice, it has somehow made its way to like the big business that you mentioned at the beginning, to governments who are now adopting just transition policies, to international NGOs, organizations like ours, but also really to grassroots organizations in many different places. And as anything that happens when a lot of different people and organizations are involved, that means somehow the concept spread in its meaning and in the way that it's being used and interpreted. And you have, on the one end of a spectrum, maybe the classical just transition approach, a relatively narrow debate around how do you compensate and protect workers who are losing their jobs because of climate policies. And then it really goes onto different levels of like social dialogue, participation, addressing distributive and also procedural justice, towards really radical demands on the other end of the spectrum that is often coming from community-based organizations that are trying to really tackle the injustices that are built into our current political economy, and that are adopting this intersectional approach that Rishabh already mentioned, I think, and they're trying to bring in questions of gender justice, racial justice, etc., and really challenging the system and promoting system change rather than change at the margins. I start with this because I think it's important to acknowledge that there are these different interpretations, because these different approaches have very different justice implications in practice. And I think it's really important to really also see just transition as a political issue and not as a technical fix, because people are involved, communities are involved, organizations and corporate interests are involved, and so it's really a negotiation and bargaining process that we need to see. I'm not at all arguing against the protection and compensation of workers who lose their jobs, of course, but I think it's really important to highlight that the more narrow interpretations of just transition often make use of a very dangerous narrative, as they imply that if only you find a green job for somebody who loses their employment, you will achieve justice. And that's just not the case, and I think that does not do justice to the concept and also to the guidelines that the ILO has published, which is much more comprehensive, and it gives us a framework to lobby for system change, but the way that it's being implemented and done in practice, unfortunately, often falls short of the many demands that people have to just transitions. And yeah, there we do need to acknowledge we live in a system of great injustice, and even if we have a perfect just transition for, let's say, coal workers in one place, that still means that there is injustice for other people who are not coal workers in that same place. And so I think it's just really important to broaden the debate around just transitions to make sure that we change systems and address root causes so that we can expand our policies to make sure that we do not actually reproduce the same systems of inequalities and injustice. We see that, I mean, this is really difficult and challenging, right? It's easy to point this out. It's much more difficult to actually implement it. But we see that even the just transition policies that have been, like in the literature, described as like the good examples, the positive examples, the Ruhr transition in Germany, you know, like it's usually showcased as a good case. It leaves communities and regions much more disadvantaged. Like the Ruhr area still today has like double the unemployment compared to the German national average. And those are really the hard questions that I think need to be negotiated and where we need to bring in additional groups. It also shows at the international level, and I think it's really great to see that there was yesterday this new declaration on calling for a just transition and to address it internationally, because if we really just look at just transition in each local area, we are completely neglecting the issue of cross-border impacts and what happens if you fuel a just transition in one place based on extractivism of rare earth, of critical metals, and so on, often in a developing country. What are the implications on the local communities that actually have to extract those metals and rare earths, etc.? I'll leave it here. I think I'll come back to some of it in the discussions, but I think it's just really important to broaden the debate, because if you can't just say just transition is one fits all solution. You have to really negotiate it, otherwise you leave people behind.
And I'll be really interested in those different interpretations as soon as we enter the debate. But before that, I would really like to hear from our final panelist, who is Taili.
Thank you. When I want to bring here in this debate my perspective as indigenous women, and because this debate sometimes that we have here in COP for us that are in the community, it's so far from our reality. And when we get this concept of just transition that is being discussed here, we get a little concern about who this perspective is coming from, who had this initiative to bring this concept, you know, what we were saying, like who is defining this concept. And for us, like when we talk about just transition, we get exactly the concern about we are transiting to what? Because I see many people thinking about what solutions we're gonna find to the energy. But for example, for us, the concern is why we want to transition to the same point. We're just getting false solutions. For example, we are not thinking about reducing the behavior that we are having with the earth. You know, like we are not changing the concept of our own ideas as humanity. We are just trying to find solutions for our own behavior that is not changing at all. We are just trying to get other solutions. So when we think about just transition, I always get the sensation transitioning to what? I think this is what we need to get clear first as a humanity, because it's not only about the groups, it's not only about indigenous, it's not only about the people in the city, but we get to have their own voice, and even that we have different perspectives on how to get there. So this is our concern as indigenous peoples here, because this place it's already created under a colonial perspective, because we're not our voice that was here helping this being constructed. So when we think about those concepts that are being discussed here, I always think how come our perspective, our cosmology are getting involved in these concepts. So for example, here in COP, we have the platform for the indigenous peoples that we can have the space to bring these issues like our own perspective, but it's limited in only one space. So when we are talking about filling these gaps, and you think that we only have separated spaces to speak, we are not filling the gap at all. We are not doing the transiting, and sorry for my English that sometimes gets stuck. As I'm exactly saying, like I have to, you know, like get adjusted to I can be understood. And so I think that just transition exactly like this, like we are having only one framework that is working for people in the world, and exactly we are having different realities happening in the ground that are not being heard. So when we are trying to fill this gap, especially for the women from the ground, it's sometimes really difficult to get in their realities and apply what is being discussed here. So I think we have more time to discuss other issues that I want to bring, but I don't want to get more on what I want to say, so I'm going to pass you. Sorry.
Thank you very much. For me, it's really important hearing this perspective. It's one that I don't get very often, so thank you very much. That's great. So that sets the scene for what we have coming up for you over the next sort of 45 minutes. And I'm going to open the discussion with a question for everyone here. Anyone can answer who feels that they have something interesting to say. So I'm sure everyone will answer. And it's sort of relating a bit to what Dunja was just saying about the different interpretations that we have of just transition. Everyone we heard in the summit so far, the term just transition is being used a lot, but I think there are lots of different understandings. So my first question is, what exactly do we mean when we're calling for a just transition? And more specifically, you know, are we talking about just one just transition, or are we talking about several just transitions?
Sure, I can continue. Yeah, I think indeed what we are saying is that the just transitions have to be inclusive, have to be gender just, have to be human rights based, and they cannot be techno fixes. And if you look at, you know, the transitions in the energy sector or in the agricultural sector, we know we need to move super fast in the coming few years, fully away from fossil fuels, fully away from nuclear. But we also have to be very, very careful that these other solutions, which we were talking about, the nature-based solutions, etc., are not excluding and leading to land grabbing and human rights abuses. So they might seem as a solution, but we have to take into account the impacts on the indigenous peoples and on the women in particular. And I think, therefore, we need to really also look at what is behind this. How do we, on the one hand, as Dunja said, support communities who will be most affected, who might be losing jobs, who might be needing new skills. And we know that many women, also in my part of the world, are not ready to enter these new jobs. We have very few women in renewable energy sector. But the type of organization we can choose and the type of policy decisions we can make sure that we are doing this in a more gender just way. For example, we very much promote the idea of working through really democratic technology organization by having prosumer approaches where we engage the citizens in setting up their own renewable energy cooperatives, and everybody can contribute to that transition in the energy sector, and you really make it a democratic technology transformation. But some technologies are just really not made for democratic governance, like nuclear industry, which is very closely linked to the military and which really lives on secrecy. So it's really a combination of, on the one hand, the choice of technologies, but also the choice what policies you have to support them. And I think very importantly is that we will need to have a social protection, as at the basis, and we really need to have a transition which is based on the care economy and valuing the care economy, and that will also help really to get a gender-just transition, because women are still the main care providers in the world, and therefore that needs to be at the core. We know that in the EU, for example, they're talking about social climate funds, which should help this this transition and this care economy, but it needs to really still be much more focused on those who are currently very excluded and the low-income families and people with a migrant background in Europe, and we need to look at similar solutions globally. So thank you.
Perhaps I could add as well, if that's fine. Yeah, all right. So the ILO is home to the guidelines, which was already mentioned, the guidelines on just transition. And what makes these guidelines very interesting is that they've been developed jointly by workers, employers, and governments. And hence you have these key actors who will play a very important role in the transition, saying that this is how the transition should frame. And a key element of those guidelines, and this is where it sort of comes down to the just transition having, the principles of the just transition will be one, rooted in these guidelines, rooting in labor standards, rooted in social dialogue, and how consultation and participation work. So in that sense, the principles of just transition should ideally be the same. Now, how it plays out at a local level, the way it is implemented, the way concerns of particular groups are addressed, now that will change from location to location. So when we, for instance, look at the ILO Convention number 169 and engagement with indigenous peoples and the consultation and participation that happens with indigenous peoples, and sort of acknowledging and understanding their worldviews, cosmologies, as was very well articulated, becomes very important. And then that vision becomes very important in that specific context. So in that regard, I think the guidelines provide a very interesting and comprehensive picture as to how to transition. And what has been quite interesting at this COP specifically is exactly what was earlier mentioned, was that there has been a declaration on just transition which clearly mentions these guidelines. It also has language which mentions human rights, which mentions issues around gender inequalities, and that's I think an interesting development which has taken place.
Thank you very much.
Do you want to? Sure. I mean, I think I'll sign on to what was already said and just point again, like when we did this report, we actually played with this exactly. We called it Mapping Just Transitions, and we put the plural S in brackets because I think it's exactly what Rishabh just said. No, we do sign on to this idea that justice and equity has to be central in low carbon transitions, and those principles and those ideas should be universal, and they should be grounded in pretty much the values that are set out in but also other international frameworks and spaces. But then the implementation can vary vastly, and I think so it depends who you ask, and I think not everybody has the same idea about what just transition should look like. And maybe not everybody has to have that exact same idea, but I think there should be maybe more specific work even to really define the principles, have more actors that have not been part in the tripartite guideline development sign on to some of these ideas or elaborate them further, depending on where they want to go with it.
And so for me, a just transition, it can have actually different perspectives, because for us, it's first we have to ask ourselves, what is justice? And from our perspective in the ground, like for me, like as a Terena woman, I will have one idea based in my cosmology, what is a justice? And when we get to think ourselves what we are transiting to where and where we are come from. So for us in this perspective, from my people, we have always to like look back and always to go forward. And when we are thinking about just transition, I always think myself on that, like what is exactly where we are going and what we came from. And so this justice that we are talking here, I hear a lot of false solutions, because sometimes we are not consider the other living beings that are here. And like, for example, here in COP, we are always talking about human rights, indigenous people's rights, but what about the rights of the other living beings that cannot speak the way that we can listen? Because for us, we can listen like the spirits of the trees, the animals, and is the way that we are thinking about just transitioning is also fair for them, or is only fair for us as humans? And so when we get in these high-level negotiations places, we have to remember where we come from as human beings, that we all come from the same place, at the same earth that we're sharing with the others. And sometimes those concepts can get really technical, and we forget about the root of our nature, you know, as living beings. So that's why I like to think about many ways to think just transition. And again, just pointing out, I think we have to have a base idea of what it is just transition, but in a way that we're including others that is not here, and we can bring their voices to these types of places. So when we are thinking about that, for example, for us, it's really clear that we have to have the free a priori consent to do and think about those concepts. It's not only about to get this concept already defined, but let's construct it together. How we are pointing our voices in these types of places that we can define where we are going, like the start point for everyone that is the same, not like getting here with already defined concept that is not including our voices within the perspective that we have in our communities. Well, what we are doing is justice for us, but for the rest of the people, and also bringing the context of where they are living. So I see many places here that is also always thinking about transiting to save the economy, save the business, save technological, like how we can use it that. And sometimes I think we're losing the starting point, as I said, like look back where we started this crisis that we are facing right now. So we only understanding where we started this crisis is where we can think about how we can transiting in a very justice and fair way. So for me, I think it's more not about so many different perspectives of looking just transitions, but how we can include these perspectives in the same concept, that we can all talk in the same page, in the same level. Yeah.
That's really interesting. And I also, I particularly like the question that you posed in your introduction when you asked transitioning to what? Because I think when you think about this, you realize, okay, well, I already have 2 or 3 ideas of what we should be transitioning to, so multiply that by every person. That sort of gives an indication of, you know, the depth of complexity that we're talking about here. You mentioned inclusion, and I think it was Rishab who mentioned consultation as sort of important criteria for realizing questions of just transition. I was wondering if you could maybe, if you had some more, you know, what is needed to actually realize sort of examples of just transition, maybe from sort of the national or local level?
Do you want to?
Sure. I mean, I think I'll give you the number 1 social scientist answer. It depends. But I'll try and look at it from, I mean, we're at COP, right? So I'll try and look at it from an international perspective. I think the number 1 thing that's needed is to bring really back in the political. And that's never an easy thing, because as we've already all said, there are many different opinions. There will be a lot of butting heads on how the way forward should be defined or agreed upon, etc. But I think it's really critical to include more voices and to look at what we're doing in an international sense, because I mean, just transition is being negotiated under response measures, right? And from the very start of the convention, response measures was about making sure that climate action and climate policies do not have more adverse impacts on people, especially in developing countries, than they have to. So there's like language in the convention saying that developed countries have to make sure that their actions meet the specific needs and concerns of developing country parties arising from the adverse effects of climate change and or the impacts of the implementation of response measures. So I think this international dimension often gets lost when we talk about just transitions. So we hear a lot of good approaches and ideas around exactly safeguarding the economy, safeguarding the workers, predominantly still in the global north, to make sure that they don't lose out. And what is missing in those debates, I mean, it's important to look at those things, yeah, I'm not saying it's not, but what is missing out almost entirely is what are the impacts of those protectionist approaches to just transition on developing countries, and also of delaying climate action on developing countries. And I think it's really, I mean, it's great to see this declaration. So far, I think 14 or 15 countries have signed on to it. I think it gives civil society some more meat than they used to have to really hold countries accountable to this language that is included on human rights, on gender, on the impacts internationally, and so on. So I think it's really this repoliticizing just transition that I think is needed to move forward.
I'm all for repoliticization of the just transition debate. We've talked about including more voices, and in both your introductory statements, we highlighted specific groups of society who will be particularly impacted by this. So I'd be really interested to hear on sort of issues around gender and intersectionality, and how you think these can be included to a greater degree in the justice transition agenda.
Sure, I can start. Thanks, sure. So now, it is fundamental to recognize that environmentally sustainable economies and a world of work that is inclusive, now these are linked and they're mutually reinforcing, and that is the direction in which just transition is sort of aspiring to. So let me give you an example with regard to persons with disabilities, for instance. Now, skills development initiatives in the renewable energy sector that are disability inclusive could pave the way for an effective match of green jobs with applicants with disabilities. Now, this is something which has to be planned in advance. It cannot be done once the transition has happened. So the fact that there are groups which struggle to access labor markets, there are groups which may not have the right skills at the right place, these are things things which need to be addressed beforehand, and that there are groups which face discrimination while entering certain kinds of jobs. There's occupation segregation, and specifically in the case of women, that there is an overburden of care responsibilities which limits their participation. These are things which need to be addressed before the transition happens, so that when the jobs come, they're able to access them. So in this regard, the inclusion agenda, I think, is at the core of just transition, at least how we see it at the ILO, that whether we're talking about indigenous peoples, persons with disabilities, or whether we're talking about women, we need to make sure that as the transition happens, they're able to access decent work within the low-carbon economy.
Yeah, I mean, I fully agree. We first need to dismantle the patriarchy, right? And then we can have a just and inclusive transition. And that, of course, means that we have to have human rights, women's rights, LGBTQI rights, people with disability rights firmly in all our legislation. And we need to also have a transition in our gender stereotypes and mindsets. And that is, of course, at the basis, I think, of a just transition. Now, you can already build that into your just transition programs. And we will be presenting on Monday the Gender Just Climate Solution Award. We do this every year since 6 years now. And it's really interesting because we're looking at how to bring more equality into these new sectors where we want to go. Yeah, the one which are low carbon, which are creating jobs, which are healthy, which are good for the ecosystem. So, and then we have some wonderful programs organized and led by women, for example, in India, where they are working on climate adaptation by making sure that they can reuse water from the monsoon period for a second and third harvest, and they have been able to increase their incomes with 40%. But the funny thing is that as soon as the government started investing in this as a just transition measure, saying, okay, this is great, let's help these farmers to do that, it didn't work, because the funds were only available to those who had land rights, and the women did not have land tenure rights. And so that was a very, I mean, we know this from many other programs as well, but you really need to build that into your just transition programs, the understanding that, first of all, you need to make sure that that women have indeed equal rights, and also in the area of land tenure or access to funding. And then you really have to have the consultations, because if you are dealing with, of course, the indigenous communities, they have to decide on their own territories and how they want to protect their common lands and forests. And so it really is very, very important that you do these consultations and that you really work with the local communities, and that they say, okay, this is what we think is the just transition, and this is what we want as as our future equal and human rights-based economy.
Thank you very much. So, involving local communities, it seems to be necessary, but is also, of course, quite challenging, I think. And one way that local communities have sort of organized themselves is by sort of identifying common fights, which I witnessed here in Glasgow, actually. So in the run-up to Glasgow, there were quite a few announced strikes from both rail workers and from cleansing workers, and I was at one of these strikes on, I think it was the day before yesterday, very early in the morning. And there we had representatives from Pakistani and from Indian trade unions who sort of spoke in solidarity. We also had Friends of the Earth and other climate justice organizations who spoke in solidarity with these unions, which sort of conjures up the question, and we've been talking about bringing in different groups and having to involve local communities. So my question would be, how do you think coalitions for the just transition can be formed, and which coalitions are really necessary for this?
You're looking at me. Do you want me to start?
I'm looking at you, Dunja.
Sure. I mean, it's not a very easy question, and I'm honestly in two minds about it. in two minds, because on the one hand, I think we really need the coalitions of the most progressive to dismantle all the injustices we heard about. I think you already touched upon the issue of solidarity. I think there's a lot more networking needed between different worker organizations in both Global North and Global South to really push for progressive interpretations of just transition. And at the same time, I mean, we are really running out of time very fast. And if we do only go for the coalitions of kind of the best possible interpretations in our own views, we might not really meet the targets that we need to really achieve here. So part of me also thinks we need to try and build the more unusual coalitions and talk to some of the people that we maybe wouldn't usually talk to or who are not exactly on the same page, and trying to kind of push some of the, it's really difficult, right? But to try and push some of the bigger players and the more powerful people who are probably a lot more conservative in the approaches than a lot of the community-based organizations, and to try and really move them even just a little bit. So I feel like it needs really broad-based coalitions, and it needs kind of different coalitions for different purposes. Like on the one hand, the really strong progressive advocacy work and work to push for kind of the dismantling the patriarchy, addressing all of these different inequalities and injustices at the same time. And at the same time, probably it's also worthwhile to go for the less optimal solutions to really achieve mitigation fast, because that will have a really important impact. So yeah, can't give you a more concrete answer than that, I think.
Nathan?
Yes.
Okay, so for me, so for us to have the coalition, like speaking and like working for the same cause, let's say like this, it's to understanding and respecting and empathize with the difference that we have it. So for example, here we have a different group that with different knowledge and from different background. And I think when we started to this point, like respecting the difference and understanding the needs of each other, we can start to really working together, you know, not trying to input or not to try to input nothing to anyone, but the coalition would start if we get in the same point of understanding. So for me, I would say also like to decolonize our minds of what we are trying to work for the planet would be the first thing, and also in a feminist perspective, because like not long ago I would even say that myself I would be a feminist, and I think we really need to have a real coalition for work for the planet, is to understand this difference that is happening, but also to be more concerned about the other and to really listen what the other have to say. And when we are thinking about just transition and these coalitions that it can happen, we also have to think in the micro level to the micro level to the micro level. So we really get these networks in the ground, and then we can get in the one voice to the higher places. So if we started in this point, I think we can have more results in these differences that I was talking about in the other questions that you made. So we can have it here, for example, in the high-level places like that. And I've seen sometimes like a lot of civil society groups that are only concerned about their own demands. So they're not listening to each other. So how we can like have the same just transition idea if you're not listening to each other, you know? So that's why I was like talking about the feminists, because I found that in that place, a place that is respecting the differences. And also I brought the decolonizing thing, because sometimes like even the feminism, sometimes it can have only one perspective. But if we decolonize our minds and open our hearts and ears and spirit to listen to each other, we can have a one coalition that it's powerful. Because if you only have like a coalition of the women, the indigenous peoples, the youth, you're not gonna reach at any point. You're not gonna fight the monster together, you know? Like you only got your own cause, and negotiation is not gonna move forward. So I think we have to really think how we can do these networks in the ground, even that we are far from each other, and we have the technology in our favor to work on that. So we can, I don't know, like really make a difference with the historic reparation that we have to be responsible with, but also remembering the others, again, that is not humans that we always are forgetting about.
Would you have anything to add to this?
No, that's perfect. I think we need coalitions where the indigenous peoples and indigenous women are leading and where we follow your lead. And I think we're already building coalitions, and we have coalitions, and they're very well visible here at the COPs because of the constituencies which we already have. And it's important that we might add some new constituencies. There's a discussion on having constituencies on disabilities, people with disabilities. That is, I think, very important. We really need to make sure that we have all the different perspectives in the coalitions. And I think, yeah, I hope we can bring the young feminists on board because they are very powerful. And when I see today also the demonstrations in the streets, we need them with us, and we need to make sure that they're also there, right with us in the center of the struggle.
Yes, it was very inspirational leaving the accommodation this morning. It kind of, I must admit, there was a tiny side of me who was, which was a bit sort of sad about going in the opposite direction that they were going in. Richard, would you have anything to add on this?
Sure, and this may sound like a very ILO perspective, but I think one more group which needs to be engaged with a lot more are businesses and employers. And I know you started off by talking about these big businesses, but I'm not just talking about that. There are millions of small and medium enterprises. There are indigenous entrepreneurs, there are women entrepreneurs who are running very small, sometimes very interesting businesses that are moving towards and contributing to low carbon economy. And we don't engage and hear enough from them at times. So this is, I think, a group which really, there are cooperatives, women's cooperatives, which are also doing very interesting work. And I think this is a group which needs to be engaged with more when we talk about coalitions. At least from the ILO perspective, it's employers and workers together are very important with governments. But when you come to the COP, you don't see enough, I feel, small and medium entrepreneurs, women entrepreneurs, indigenous entrepreneurs who have disabilities, engaging in these discussions as much. And I think that is a gap which should be filled, because they have a very important role as well in taking forward climate action.
Okay, thank you very much for your answers. And I do have a couple more questions, but I was wondering at this point, talking about inclusion, if there was anyone who had a raised hand who was watching digitally. Are there any questions? If you have a question, you can just click on the icon, the raised hand icon, and then you will basically be beamed into this room. I will wait a couple of seconds. If there is nothing, there's still one issue which I would like to pick up on. So maybe I'll ask my question, and those people can still decide whether to pose a question. So, just coming back to the title, to the exact title of this event, which is Uncovering Justice Gaps in Just Transitions, Why Technological Solutions Won't Solve the Crisis. And I think you mentioned, Sasha, in your beginning statement about the danger of technological solutions and how there's no sort of real future pathway for them to change the structure of marginalization and inequality which we have at the moment. So I'm just wondering, as a layperson, how can I sort of identify a technical solution which we should be wary of, And I mean, we mentioned nuclear, we mentioned carbon markets. I'm just wondering, what are the red flags where I should be concerned about when I hear these global leaders talking about how fantastic this is?
Yeah, if they're being presented as the net zero solution, then you have to be worried. But I think indeed what we have not discussed, and there are several of them, even in the renewable energy area. Yeah, large hydro dams are really terrible, and they are also emitting methane. So and they destroy our river ecosystems, and we have seen a lot of displacements of millions of people, indigenous peoples in particular. So we also have to be looking at the scale of the solutions, and they might be renewable, but they might lead to human rights abuses, as with Berta Cáceres and the terrible case in her country. She was killed around an indigenous people's struggle around a hydro power plant. So I think that is very important to understand, that it's often also about scale, and if you can have a scale which can be done locally, with democratic organization, with participation of all the communities, then that can work very well. But often we are hearing here about the multi-mega geoengineering options, solar mirrors in the sky or fertilizing the oceans, and these are unproven, high-risk bullshit solutions, just to get investments into existing big polluting companies, and therefore that is what you should be really wary about if they don't bring a fast solution, because that's the good thing. We have solar, we have wind solutions which can be done by women's cooperatives, which can bring you power tomorrow to off-grid communities, and we don't need to wait 10 or 15 years for an unproven technology to try and do the same. And then it will be too late anyway, because we only have 7 years and 8 months. So let's really invest in those democratically organized, decentralized solutions, and make sure that we have these small entrepreneurs really taking that up, and they will need support for that. And so we need to really transit the funding away from the subsidies, which we're still giving. My country still subsidizes with about 20 billion a year their investments in fossil fuels in countries abroad. These funds, these 20 million, that is what we need to input in our local economies and into these cooperatives and into agroecology and solutions which are good for our health and for the planet and for jobs, for women and indigenous peoples and youth. And yeah, that's what I would suggest.
I am told that we have a question from Abigail Martin. So Abigail, the floor is yours. We can't yet hear you, Abigail, I'm afraid.
Can you hear me now?
Yes, we can hear you now.
Okay. Okay, first of all, thank you for such a wonderful panel. I'm really so pleased hearing about all these different types of initiatives and highlighting women's cooperatives. I think that's so essential. My question is sort of building on a point that Dunja made regarding, having to make some difficult choices about building progressive coalitions. And I wonder if some of the panelists have thought about what the key challenges are in engaging the mainstream labor movement and this kind of sort of organizing activity. When you think about big players in the labor movement, whether it's the GMB in the UK or the UAW in the US, we're looking at organizations mostly run by white men. But these are also the sort of power players in the mainstream progressive scene. So I just wanted to see if anyone had thoughts on the kind of immediate political tasks at hand in building those coalitions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Abigail, for that great question. Since you referred to Dunja, I would offer the floor to Dunja first.
Sure. No, thank you. It's a super relevant question, and I think for me, not being in the space of being a labor organizer or working on very concrete just transition initiatives myself, the first step that I see will be to identify kind of the most progressive people within those large organizations, and to start a dialogue very personal. Because I think at the end of the day, it often comes to like interpersonal relations that you can build up with people in those organizations to kind of really understand what their perspectives are, to see where they are willing to go into a progressive direction compared to where maybe they, or in some cases, some of their member organizations, if it's really these umbrella labor unions, where the kind of, I don't know the English word right now, but where like the critical points are, where some members might not be willing to move at all, and where, so kind of really starting on an individual level, trying to push a little bit, like step by step. I don't see any other way, I think, because we have seen labor movements come around quite a bit since all this just transition talk started. No, there used to be, I think, a lot more opposition in some of the more conservative and the more affected unions, and they are starting now to adopt just transition language and to really try and use the concept and so on. So yeah, I would start with that, but I wish I could give you a better answer, Abigail.
Labor movements. Richard, would you have anything to say on?
So I'm not a labor organizer, but I feel that a part of the problem is also a question of narratives, right? This is because we've been having a narrative for some time that climate action is going to kill jobs, it's an issue. And I think this narrative is now being countered to some extent that, no, this is not the case. It can be a boost for jobs. And I think part of the issue then is also, and I think this is a technical issue, not a political issue necessarily, is to inform what are the benefits of the just transition? How can workers benefit? And this information needs to reach out to a lot of people. And I think this will sort of also change this perspective, this narrative that was earlier harped upon, that climate action is a job killer. So I think in this sense, of course, it's also from us, but it's an overall effort that people are informed about the fact that that narrative is not really the case, and that a just transition can create decent work. And I think that can be a step forward then in this issue.
Thank you very much, Richard. Abigail, I hope that sort of answers your question. And in the interest of time, I'm just looking at the clock. We don't have much left, unfortunately. So we agreed before this panel that everyone would prepare a one-sentence statement at the end. In the form of a demand or a different statement. I left this part pretty open. So with that, I would give the floor to each of our distinguished guests or panelists today to close out the session. Who would like to start? Shall we?
I can start.
Okay.
I mean, we need much more redistribution measures for just transition, and we need to really also increase the minimum wages, especially of sectors where we have a lot of women, especially the care worker sectors, and we need this tax redistribution systems much more strongly than we have at the moment, and if we can take that into our discussions, that will be very important. Thank you.
For me, inclusion is core to just transition, and it not only ensures that people are not left behind, groups which are already facing marginalization and challenges are not left behind, but it also ensures that everyone is uplifted, everyone is more empowered. And an example of this is universal design principles, which would support greater disability inclusion, will support everybody's inclusion as well. So that is very important. So it sort of raises the standard, it raises the bar. So inclusion is not just about targeting one person or targeting a group, it's about raising everyone higher.
Say more, Dora?
As you wish.
Okay, can I? Yeah, what do you want?
No.
Okay, sorry. So for me, if we're really looking for just transition, I think we we need to get more conscious about the needs that we are having as humanity and understand what bring us to this crisis that we are living. If we not understand what bring us here, we cannot think about justice at all for the entire living beings that I was saying. So also like not forgetting about the gaps that we are seeing in the society and how like to enclose them. So for me it would be, to be more conscious. Thank you.
This might sound really obvious, but I think we have to take justice seriously and to really connect struggles of different constituencies and groups and to connect climate justice to just transition more strongly.
And with that, I don't think there's really much for me left to say. So I would really like to thank you all very much for what, in my eyes, has been a very fascinating debate. I would also like to thank my colleagues at the Rosa-Luxemburg-Stiftung who helped set all this up. I really had a very minor part to play in that. I would also like to thank the technical support team here who have allowed for this really nice, smooth running of the event. I hope you all have a very fruitful remaining COP. And I'll see you all tomorrow at the Global Day of Action for Climate Justice in Glasgow. Thank you very much.